Hello, my name's Toby Walsh. I'm a Professor of Artificial Intelligence at UNSW in Sydney, Australia, and SARO's Data 61. And I'm disappointed not to be with you in person today, and I very much hope in a year or so's time when everyone's vaccinated and hopefully we're on better charge of the pandemic, that I will have that opportunity to meet you all in person. But I wanted to talk to you today about ethical issues around AI, and in particular, why all the fuss? Why is it that you can't open a newspaper today without reading about some new development of artificial intelligence, and in particular, the ethical concerns that that is raising? And we see this, not surprisingly, because at many different levels, governments have been announcing very ambitious programs, investing hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds into artificial intelligence, and correspondingly developing ethical frameworks to deal with those developments. And I must admit some responsibility here. I was charged with preparing an AI plan for Australia, chairing the committee that produced the plan, and also sitting on the committee that produced an ethical framework, ethical guidelines for its successful deployment within Australia. But we don't see this just at the governmental level. We see this within corporations. Many of the big tech giants like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft have developed ethical principles to guide their use and deployment of artificial intelligence. And we see it within many other organizations. And again, I must admit some responsibility here. I've been working on one of the IEEE committees looking at developing standards for autonomous systems. I've been working with ISO also on their standards for artificial intelligence. And as another example, not so long ago, we had the OECD nations declare their 21 ethical principles that have subsequently been adopted by a wider group of nations. And so there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, a lot of proposals for ethical frameworks to deal with the new challenges that artificial intelligence throws up. Now, I find this somewhat surprising because artificial intelligence isn't the first new technology that's touched our lives. For hundreds of years now, we've been going through the Industrial Revolution, developing new technologies that have very large impacts upon people's lives. And in many respects, there's nothing new, there's very little new that artificial intelligence throws up that other previous technologies didn't previously throw up themselves. And indeed, I think we should look at those previous examples, that history, to understand what are the appropriate ethical principles, frameworks that we should be looking at when we look to deploy artificial intelligence in a responsible way. Now, of course, the one area that has perhaps been most developed, most advanced in dealing with these sorts of ethical challenges is medicine and biomedical devices, for a very good reason. Those touch people's lives. Artificial intelligence isn't much different. It lets us break things like other technologies has. It may let us break things faster, cheaper, at a greater scale than previous technologies. But the way it breaks things is in many respects the same as previous technologies, with one exception. I'm going to talk about the one new thing that artificial intelligence does bring that no previous technology had. So we can look, though, to medicine and biomedical devices and the like, for a pretty comprehensive set of ethical principles that have guided their development that I think actually provide a very good starting point, and indeed, apart from that one exception, a pretty good ending point for understanding what are the ethical principles, the ethical frameworks that we need for dealing with artificial intelligence. Now, there are four fundamental cornerstones to medical ethics: beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. And those four cornerstones are, I believe, very relevant and very are very reasonable foundations for the ethical principles with which we should study and govern artificial intelligence. Beneficence, the idea that that we should be doing net good. That applies just as much to artificial intelligence as it does to medical devices. Non-maleficence, that we should worry about whether the technologies do any harm to any individual. Autonomy, autonomy in the medical setting is about the autonomy of the individual, respecting the autonomy of the patient. That requires us to get informed consent and not to engage in deceptive practices. Again, these are principles that can be applied just the same to artificial intelligence. And then finally, a large principle of justice, which covers issues like fairness, discrimination, and various issues around equity. And again, those are important principles within the deployment of artificial intelligence just as much as they are within the development of medicine. So I said there was one new ethical concern that artificial intelligence creates that we haven't had to previously address with past technologies. And that comes back to this idea of autonomy. And previously when I was talking about autonomy, I was talking about autonomy of the patient, something that's a very important principle within medicine. But we do have a new type of autonomy now. We have the autonomy of machines. And it's therefore not so surprising that some of the most interesting, some of the most vigorous, and some of the most novel ethical debate we've had around artificial intelligence has been around autonomy, in particular around things like autonomous cars. A trolley problem, a car comes around the corner, there's a pedestrian who's stood in the road, the car has to decide, does it run into the pedestrian, possibly killing the pedestrian? Does it swerve off the road into a brick wall, possibly killing the occupants of the car? This is a problem because for the first time we're giving machines the right to make decisions, and those decisions might have life or death consequences. And so that is something, that is an area where we do face fresh ethical challenges, ones that perhaps we've not had to address with previous technologies. And of course, the other aspect of autonomy, one that does trouble me greatly, one where I've even had the privilege of speaking at the United Nations about, is around autonomous warfare. The fact that we'll be giving possibly, potentially, the decision to machines as to who lives and who dies in the battlefield. And the challenging issues around accountability, around international humanitarian law, around the fact that this may be lowering the barriers to war. These challenging issues that autonomy on the battlefield is creating. So, to go back to my claim, artificial intelligence, with that one exception of autonomy, creates no new ethical challenges, although it does perhaps change the scale, speed with which things can be done. And that itself, as I'm going to talk about in the next half of my talk, does create some somewhat fresh challenges, even if we don't need any new ethical principles to understand the fact that we can do things quicker, cheaper, or at greater scale does perhaps take us to new places where we have to worry about things that we previously didn't have to worry about. So let me give a few of those examples. Here's one example, predictive policing. Now, we can collect data as to where crime takes place. Here's a heat map of crime in downtown Washington. And we can use that for what seems like a good purpose. We can use that to work out where to deploy limited police resources. Where should we send police patrols? Where crime has previously taken place, that seems a good place to direct our limited resources. But there's a fundamental problem here. There's a fundamental problem, well, several fundamental problems actually. One of the fundamental problems, of course, is that this is historical data. It reflects the biases of the system in which it was collected. Perhaps we had sent more patrols into poor black neighborhoods in the past, and therefore caught more criminals in those neighborhoods. And therefore, if we use machine learning to predict where crime took place based upon that historical data, we're going to perpetuate the injustices of the past. We're going to continue to send police patrols into those poor neighborhoods and continue to capture criminals just in those neighborhoods. And that's not surprising, therefore creates issues around fairness and discrimination. But there is, even if we can adjust, even if we can, and we could possibly take into account those biases, there is a fundamental problem here, a deep fundamental problem. And it rises in this problem, but it rises in many other settings, which is we don't actually have ground truth. And it's not clear that we could ever collect ground truth for this problem and indeed for many other problems. We don't know, we can never probably know where crime takes place. We know where crime took place, where we're able to apprehend the criminals. But there was lots of crime that took place that we didn't actually observe. And it's hard to imagine that we could ever collect all the data to make sure that we collected all the crime. So we're predicting something from a proxy, and it's not clear how we would ever collect the true statistic. Another example, and I like this example because it highlights how, even though artificial intelligence doesn't let us do anything fundamentally new, it can fundamentally change the systems in which we're operating, is to consider something like insurance, car insurance. Now, we can increasingly collect data to help us better price risk in areas like car insurance or health insurance or life insurance. We can collect data off our smartphones or our devices about how we drive. Do we brake more than other drivers? Do we drive more erratically? Do we drive more? That means we can more accurately price the risk of an individual driver. But that goes fundamentally against the whole idea of insurance. Insurance is about spreading risk. It's not actually about pricing risk exactly. If we could price risk exactly, there would be no benefit into insurance. Everyone would pay exactly their true cost. The idea of insurance is that no one individual can afford the catastrophic consequences, a car crash in which your car is written off or people are seriously injured. And so we spread that over a community of people. Well, if we can price risk exactly, then we're not spreading that risk exactly. And as a good example of this, we see in Europe a few years ago, there was a law passed that no insurance product, life insurance, car insurance, health insurance, no insurance product could be priced differently based upon gender. Men and women had to be given the same prices for insurance. This had a very interesting knock-on consequence. The knock-on consequence was that the insurance rates for women went up. Women and men had to be charged the same money, the same premiums for car insurance. In the past, women had cheaper car insurance because women are better drivers than men. That's a historical fact. If you look at the statistics, women have fewer accidents and less costly accidents than men. Men are worse drivers than women. Now, because of this law, women and men have to be charged the same insurance rates, which means that women's insurance rates now went up, so that women are subsidizing the bad driving of men. This is an example of how, by pricing risk more exactly, we're making a societal choice. And in Europe, they made one choice. That insurance products should be blind to gender. And the consequences of that, of course, are that women now are paying more for their car insurance, rightly or wrongly. And artificial intelligence, by allowing us to price risk, is going to throw up lots of these ethical conundrums because we will be able to make decisions that previously we didn't have the data or ability to be able to make at scale. And I do joke, actually, in my recent book, that every company, insurance companies, for example, are going to have a CPO, a chief philosophical officer, to help them deal with the philosophical challenges that these sorts of this sort of AI systems can now throw up. Another example of something that we can now do, certainly at scale, that we couldn't do in the past, is face recognition. We've certainly got used to the idea that the CCTV cameras are everywhere, but there aren't enough people, enough operators to look at those cameras and to identify people in them. But we can now put computer vision algorithms behind those cameras and do face recognition at the level of a city, or even at the level of a nation state. And we already can see worrying ideas of where that's going to take us in China and elsewhere. As an example of what you can do now that you previously couldn't do, China is deploying face recognition software at scale, and they were able recently, not so long ago, to pick out a wanted felon, a wanted criminal, in a rock concert of 60,000 people. That's something that human eyes can't do. A human can't scan a crowd of 60,000 people and see a person, pick out a particular person. But computer eyes can do that. That takes us to a new, potentially troubling place, one that writers like Orwell and Huxley have warned us about. It used to be if you went on a political demonstration, you were essentially anonymous. Now you can go out in a crowd and we have the potential to identify everyone in that crowd. No longer can you protest about things that you find troubling in society, whether that be going on a climate change march or a Me Too movement march. That's how we've always changed society and made it a better place in the past. Now we can be recognized, identified, and possibly persecuted. And it's worth pointing out that these systems are brittle. Artificial intelligence systems don't work like computer vision systems, for example, don't work like human eyes. They work in very different ways, and they can be easily fooled. We can change a single pixel and turn a cat into a dog. Here's a nice example. We can write on an apple a piece of paper that says iPod and fool the object recognition system that that's no longer an apple, that's now an iPod. Something that human eyes would not be fooled by, but computer vision systems can be easily fooled. So it's worth remembering that these systems are also going to break in strange and different ways to human systems that we've been used to in the past. So there are still, even if we don't need new ethical frameworks, there are still many problems that we need to address, and not surprisingly, there are many different solutions, and solutions aren't just technological, although there certainly are technological solutions that we need, or technological fixes that are part of the answer to these problems, but there are definitely political issues that we need to address. What sort of society is it we want it to be? There are economic issues that we need to address and societal issues that we need to address. So these are complex problems that touch all of society that don't just have technical fixes. So what do we need? Well, there's still lots of research needed to be done, and that needs, not surprisingly, to be multidisciplinary because it needs to bring in not just computer scientists like myself, but philosophers, anthropologists, political scientists, sociologists, historians, so we learn from the past. There's lots of different disciplines that need to contribute to this research, but it needs more than just research. It needs to engage all of society. These are about what sort of society do we want these technologies to help us to build. And that requires vigorous and active public debate. For that public debate to take place and to be a good sort of public debate, we of course need more education. People need to be better informed. Unfortunately, a lot of people's understanding of artificial intelligence is what Hollywood has given them the idea of, and the reality is much simpler, much more prosaic. Indeed, it's not super intelligence, it's not smart AI that I'm mostly worried about. It's about stupid AI, that we'll be giving responsibility to machines, and those machines don't have appropriate capabilities. And finally, we do need more regulation. We need more policy in this space. We have perhaps allowed the tech companies too many freedoms in the past. Those are conversations that I've started to, many of my colleagues have started to engage in, because it needs obviously to be informed by the capabilities and the limitations of the technologies to ensure that we have appropriate regulation. But we see, especially in places like Europe, a very healthy, fruitful debate going on, and policy and regulation starting with GDPR, but now with the AI Act that's starting to be discussed in detail within Europe, and no doubt similar regulations are going to find their way into other settings in other nations and supranational bodies. If you want to, of course, these are debates that I imagine are going on within Korea. They're very important conversations that need to take place. Here's an example I just pulled from the newspaper a couple of days ago, just to highlight the importance of worrying about these issues. North Korea is, it seems, equipping itself with drones, no doubt, which will have autonomous capabilities before too long. And therefore, the debate around autonomous weapons is one that South Korea needs to be actively engaged in the United Nations and elsewhere, because it's one that really touches the security of the Korean Peninsula. I am troubled. I lie awake at the night thinking about what would happen if one side of the DMZ attacked the other with autonomous weapons, and there was no defense against such weapons, and the only defense was an escalation to possibly a nuclear conflict. That would be a terrible occurrence to have taken place, one that we should try and avoid as soon as we possibly can. If you want to know more, I encourage you to take a look at my recent book, 2062, The World That AI Made. It's available in about a dozen languages now, not just in English, but it's actually now you can find in Korean. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. Thank you very much.